All right, everybody, welcome back. Here we are at our Policy and Practice Subcommittee of the FAC for our March meeting. And looking forward to a great conversation today with you all, as well as our guests from GSA. We got one here and a couple of them will be joining later in the meeting. So wanted to do first things first and just kind of do a quick roll call, see who all is here. And I'm just going to just look around my Zoom boxes here and call your name. I see David Wagger.
Present.
Luke Basis. Here's my look. Nicole Darnell. We got Nigel Stevens. We got Amlan Mukherjee.
Present.
I see Richard Butel.
Present.
And Jenny Romer.
Here.
Great. And then Troy as well, of course. So Anish, I think I might have missed you, Anish, and I see Anish as well. Good to see you all. Well, with that said, I'm going to quickly turn it over to Luke, and then just a statement for anyone who might be here from the public. I think I might have seen a couple names earlier that will have an opportunity for you to chime in towards the end of the meeting. So Luke, back to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is a real pleasure to see all of you again. I was unable to attend the last meeting, but I watched it on YouTube. Thank you, David, for stepping in and leading it. You did a fantastic job. We had two fantastic guests and a good discussion afterwards. I'm upset I missed it, but glad I was able to view it online and glad there was quite a bit of engaging conversation afterwards. I think we've given you guys a heads up that we are going to have 3 special guest stars from the GSA today. We'll let them introduce themselves when we get to them in the second hour, but we wanted to use the first half of this meeting to kind of set the context for where we are and where we're going. As you know, we're kind of reaching the culmination of the third trimester, I guess, of this Policy and Practice Subcommittee and our third round of recommendations. We, have been working together for quite some time, and at least on the calendar as of now, we have only one more public meeting before our final presentation meeting in May. So we really wanted to try to use this first hour and ultimately our next public meeting to get to a conclusion on what our recommendations are. But we wanted to begin here with a bit of reflection on our journey. Then we'll talk about how we can potentially move forward. Then we'll hear from our GSA friends and experts in what will probably be a great opportunity to tap into them and find out what would be what meaningful work we can do between now and May. And then we'll hear from the public and we'll have closing remarks. Next slide, Boris. So do you folks remember this? This was the mission we struggled to come up with over, I think, 2 to 3 meetings, quite a bit of work. Our mission is to recommend actionable changes to the GSA procurement policies that encourage innovation and streamline the acquisition process to accelerate the demand and utilization of goods and services from a diverse supplier base to achieve measurable progress on climate and sustainability goals. And we came up with this neat graphic to the right here, the policy, process, and technology, and the intersection thereof as a way of capturing, I think, the topics we were looking at the time. And it still remains relevant today. So we put this out here just because it's been such a long time, but I think we have held close to what our mission was over the last couple of months together. Next slide, Boris. Now, if you think back and reflect on the work that the total subcommittee has done, it really has yielded an incredible book of knowledge and recommendations in a whole host of different areas. We are responsible for 4. Workforce has been a workhorse and managed to put out 7 different recommendations. it is an impressive body of work. And I would say, we have had the benefit of some folks that have sat on both committees, so we've been able to relay and tie recommendations to each other when it was appropriate. But there is some common themes, I think, that have emerged, and there are probably some areas we have talked about in either one or multiple committees that we may not have gotten to tackle. And so I just want to put that out there, because I think one of the common themes that has emerged in many of these recommendations is the use of data, or the supply of data, or really the topic of data in all forms and uses. Next slide. So at this point, we have been, I'd say, benefiting from the great work that Amlan has done. The recommendations he took us through in January, the draft recommendations, the discussions we've had, the guests we've heard from since, Cievo, Mr. Arbuckle, and the different topics that he's covered, all of which also kind of have this central vein related to data. Credible data, verifiable data, data that we can use in how we evaluate products, a data infrastructure that's open and publicly available and available for industry and for buyers, and ultimately data that can serve as the basis for development of a curriculum for education. Next slide. So it's not just our current working recommendations, but going back to all of the work that's been done in the first report, a recommendation to sponsor a maturity model for embedding sustainability in climate risk management at GSA. In the second report, there was a recommendation related to developing and leading a cross-agency effort to establish a federal data standard and protocols for eco-label certification and utilization. And of course, data was pervasive in our comments to the FAR rule, to encourage GSA to develop and implement a plan for stronger federal data standards and protocols for eco-label certifications. Next slide. So here we are. We have been working on a lot of different areas. We have had some common themes and some common veins. We've had the topic of data, the use of data, how other agencies have used it. But there are still a number of areas we probably haven't touched on. And so David, myself, Nicole, Amlan, we've probably all had side conversations about, where do we go from here? How do we wrap our heads around this topic and come up with something specific and actionable and something that the GSA can take and work with? And so, we feel we're kind of at a crossroads, and we really want your help and your input. And we want to use this time now to kind of have a dialogue. We have a lot of data, topics that we've looked into, guests that we've spoken to, things that we've done, issues we've identified, recommendations we've already made. How do we take that in the next 60 days and turn it into a recommendation that will have a high likelihood of implementation at the GSA? And so we threw out just some questions here that we've been scratching our head about as potential, topical areas for data. We have talked about vendor entity evaluation and how can a vendor be assessed when being contemplated for an award. The topic of a vendor scorecard came up. We heard from Cievo at the last meeting, where you could do a deep dive into a vendor and a vendor's performance history and a product and sustainability related data to that product. How do we tackle, purchasing data to inform executive strategy, right? I mean, I think we know that executives at the GSA and the federal government and the public in general want to know where are the target areas, where we should be, or the GSA should be focusing their resources in order to have maximum climate impact. Where does that data come from? Who's analyzing it? How does it turn into something that's actionable and usable to make strategic decisions? And who's tracking sustainable spend? I threw up a snippet from our good friends at the state of Minnesota who have that wonderful website we've talked about, and a whole website talking about procurement and sustainable products and how much they spend and measures and what they've accomplished and the barriers they've encountered, and it ultimately rolls up into a number at the bottom, 16% sustainable spend. What do we have an equivalent to this? Should we work towards it? What are the pieces that are missing? We've also talked about data to inform procurement decisions, not just vendor entity evaluation, but product evaluation. What are the certifications that we're requiring? Are they independently verifiable? How can we use them to make a procurement decision that's transparent, and can withhold public scrutiny and survive protest decisions? And ultimately, data is not the end of it, right? Because we can have all of this data and we can make it available and we can track it. But if the GSA doesn't have a mechanism for analyzing the data and turning it into decisions, or a governance structure for turning that data into decisions, and that's, then you haven't really accomplished anything, right? So I think there are more questions than answers. There are more topics than we'll ever be able to tackle in 60 days, but we've all kind of been on this journey together for a year and change, almost 2 years, if you can believe it, folks. Time does fly, doesn't it? But we have had some common themes, and we have had quite a bit of common knowledge on this common journey together. And so, we would like to open this up and hear from, the entire committee. What are you thinking? What should we be focused on? How can we narrow in on something? We can't do it all, but we don't want to leave anything on the table that we've kind of brought up and haven't been able to tackle yet. And so I'd like to ask David if he'd like to start, get his feedback.
Hey, Luke, and good to see everybody. Great presentation, nice compact summary of where we've been and where we may end up going. At the last meeting, you mentioned CAVO, and you mentioned USDA's presentation. CAVO showed the power of a platform, not necessarily that one, to visualize data so that procurement officers can make good decisions, again, as you said, Luke, that are resilient and can satisfy government needs and will withstand any kind of scrutiny, both from protests or also just the veracity of the data. Are the data true, and will they move our mission forward? Then we saw from USDA the federal LCA Commons, which I think would be what we would want to use, because one, it's open. Two, I think for other reasons such as industry partnerships, it's open to small entities, innovative entities. It reduces a barrier to getting more entrants and more sustainable products into the system to increase sort of the relative sustainable spend. So I think certainly from that perspective, that feeds into the topics that Amlan had set out in the was shown in the previous slide, the 4 areas. And certainly open it up to the floor to see which direction do you think we can make the most advancement in. It'll be interesting to hear from GSA later. It might give us some clues about what are the most fruitful pathways. They may be very far down the road in certain areas and have less. They're not as far along in other areas, and that might be a guide to us in terms of how to prioritize recommendations if we have more than one. So I'll return it to you, Luke, or anyone on the floor. Thank you.
David, I appreciate that. Great comments. Amlan, you've been one of our thought leaders on all of these topics. I'd like to get your feedback, and I think David, you made a good point. We're kind of cluing in for our conversation in the second hour here, where we can hopefully target a little bit of what we figure out in the first hour towards some good questions for our GSA representatives.
Yeah, well, thank you, Luke and David. I think when we started working on this and the ideas we had, I was coming at it from a nuts and bolts angle, but I think the conversation has evolved actually in the last few months through more conversation with Luke and getting a deeper practitioner procurement specialist perspective to it. And I really like where we're going with this right now, because I think we've kind of the ideas, there were the ideas of what we want, and they've kind of like differentiated out along a spectrum of where, you know, each of those needs need to be fulfilled and what those specific needs are. So like all the way, so we there was the CFO, there was this the software, which is more like visualization, bringing different components of this very complex space of data and data and informatics around, and the decision-making aspects of it, thresholds, benchmarks. There's just a whole different ways in which data is being aggregated as well. And to bring that to a decision maker and help procurement specialists use the data, I think that's like right on top. There are these tools, and there's a need for innovation, there's a market for innovation there. And then moving down that that information supply chain, so to say, or I guess up that information supply chain, all the way to the foundations of like, where do we have our fundamental lifecycle inventories? And that's where the federal LCA comments come in. So there is principles there, all the way from principles to practice. So that entire, forgive my accordion hands there, but that entire supply chain of information, from it being collected, archived, developed, and then turned into tools that can be used by a supply chain, by procurement specialists. And I think that's, you know, we've used the terms, the principles framework. So the principle framework is at one end of it, and the other end of it is other real tools that are getting implemented based on the principles framework. And the general idea is to really create this space where there can be multiple tools. Again, GSA is not going to pick a specific tool, but really create, like, based on the principles framework, here is an API, so to say, that if you want to be a tool that can be used in the procurement market, you have to meet the requirements within this API. And so kind of create that space for the tools, while at the same time ensure that there is some competition there, and the ability to differentiate different tools, whether they're using AI, however they're innovating, fantastic. But at the same time, ensuring that they're all using standardized data sets and methods. So like the standards at the bottom, and on top, we have the ability to differentiate and specialize and compete. So all of that turns into what we've been calling the data infrastructure. So in terms of like the principles framework and the tools, and tying that all together into the data infrastructure. Hopefully that made sense.
Yes. So I think if I had to try to picture Amlan's ideal world, it is a centralized federal resource for free, available, verifiable, and credible data for every procurement category, related to sustainability, with industry established best practices that could be used by any number of tools to assist in the decision making on any of these topics we've talked about, whether it's vendor selection, evaluation, or informing strategy, or selecting products amongst one another, but a massive federal centralized kind of I don't know want to call it a library. I think they barely exist anymore. But that's kind of what you're picturing as an end game, right? I mean, that's
right. Yes,
yeah.
And interestingly, with EPA working on their Green Label program, which is out for comment right now, which again, if you're welcome to go and look at how that's shaping up. It is out for public comment period right now, and so with all of that, I think this would help support, would be in conformance with what EPA wants out of there. So again, kind of creating standard rules and data sets, but at the same time allowing for competitive tools and innovation in that space.
Awesome, thank you. How about you, Nigel? Nigel? No. You're on mute. All right, we'll come back to Nigel. Mark.
Thank you, Luke, and appreciate the dialogue today. It really is framing it well, and you summarized it really excellent with a good prelude. The things that caught my attention is your fundamental question: how do we add value? And the ones that stood out, at least to me, was the vendor scorecard, product certification, and label plus data to inform procurement. I think those would be the top focus items I would choose. And if we could do that somehow and help queue it up, we don't have to actually do the work as I understand it, but we have to do the thinking behind it and frame it. And that's where I would head next.
Great, Mark. Yeah, I think we should definitely bring that up with our GSA friends when they jump on at 4 o'clock. See how they feel about it. Richard, how about you?
Yeah, Luke, I wanted to weigh in on this. I like this approach, driving transparency through the use of harmonized and not streamlined necessarily, but credible data reporting, provided that the data is structured apples to apples, across a specific industry, and is credible data and doesn't take tons of money to provide the reporting going forward, but it should be voluntary. Like participating in the program, and whether it manifests itself in a scorecard or some other mechanism, should be voluntary to the industrial base, and it should be tied in to provide it with specific value. It should be tied in perhaps with past performance with PEPRS, which is the past performance database. So when government goes out on the street looking for to fulfill a requirement, they should add a category to those past performance indicia that they'll be looking at, a category around this data. So that is the stick. My point being that if it's a voluntary, transparent reporting of uniform data categories, that's not too expensive for firms to come up with, and then it becomes an incentive or gives you a leg up in the context of reinforcing your past performance and burnishing your past performance, making you more attractive. That is a carrot. Rather than having prescriptive sticks, regulatory requirements, particularly for small businesses. So that was my thinking.
I like it, Richard. So are you saying voluntary in that the decision point for a vendor is whether they want to do business with the federal government, and that would be the voluntary aspect of it, or voluntary in that you could do business with the federal government either way, but that, participating in the scorecard process might add points or something like that?
Yeah, it's the latter.
The latter. Okay.
This isn't a gate. I mean, basically you can bid on government opportunities with or without this information, but you're way better off if you have it, because it gives you a competitive leg up.
So that's there's an interesting equivalent, I think, in my own experience. Oftentimes when we look at a vendor's past performance, we'll look to see if they've got good kind of subcontracting, either small or disadvantaged business or minority or woman-owned business. But if you've never done business with the federal government before, you have no history, right? And should you be at a disadvantage in that context? No, right? We have to be willing to kind of come up with an equivalency, or we can't put too much weight on something like that just because you haven't done business with the federal government or a state or local government before. We can't necessarily punish you. But if you have and you've done well and you've met and exceeded those requirements, that's certainly something that we should be able to evaluate. And, as far as looking at your criteria related to your firm.
Well, that's particularly applicable in this context where commercial environmental standards may exceed what the government requires, and it would be anomalous for a potential bidder to be foreclosed from a government opportunity because they have commercial standard adherence, which exceed the federal government, but they don't have a federal government use case of environmental standards. So that would be anomalous. Sometimes if they're doing better in the private sector, they should be able to report on that, even if it's not a federal use case specifically.
Thank you for the comments, Richard. How about you, Anish?
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I think that I appreciate, Amland's and Rich's comments. I was thinking about how the kind of like post validation of this and like how GSA tracks successes associated with sustainable procurement. So something on my mind is, as we kind of finalize, whatever our last recommendations are on this topic, like adding a recommendation there on improving tracking, and it kind of ties into transparency too, because it enables the staff who are working on this to understand where sustainable procurement is already streamlined and is easy versus places where it is more challenging or there needs to be more due diligence done. So this kind of like element of tracking is something that I would be interested in adding to that.
Good, thank you, Anish. Nicole? Another one of our thought leaders on the topic here.
Hey there. I really, really appreciate this conversation. The questions that you posed at the end, Luke, I thought were really, really useful in helping organize the conversation. I look at those questions and I think going back to what Mark Hayden was saying, although I'm thinking about this in two categories. I think maybe he was thinking about it in three, but I really see two real big buckets here. One relates to vendor sustainability and assessing vendor sustainability by way of scorecards or something similar. And then the second layer is product sustainability, because it's not enough to just look at the organization. You have to go down and look at what you're really purchasing from that vendor. And it's like the 1-2 of figuring out where the sweet spot is. You need to have both. One without the other is just half the story. And the beauty is, by focusing at each of those levels, you inherently get at this issue of measurement and assessment, tracking spend and everything else, because it relates to both of these higher level arguments. I'm also thinking, as this conversation is rolled forward, to an earlier conversation, and I think Michael, I'm hoping that maybe this might be Michael Bloom, this might be part of the conversation later today. When you came and spoke with us in August, this is the Acquisition Workforce Subcommittee, where we talked about the fact that GSA really isn't organized to manage data of this sort as yet. And we discussed the possibility of the creation of an office of data, a place where this information would live, where the assessment could really take place. An office of data may be bigger than around sustainability. It might incorporate other things that GSA is tracking right now, or is on the frontier of tracking related to cybersecurity and other aspects. But as we think about this sort of 1-2 punch of vendor and product level assessment, I think it's important for us to think about what that organizing framework might be and weigh in on that to some extent.
So I think,
Luke, can I follow up on that? The data
Absolutely.
piece, that just a heads up, there's been an attempt, and this may be crossing into the legislative side of things. Congressman Jerry Conley has introduced and has been working on legislation for a number of years now, trying to figure out how to manage that data issue, particularly as data science becomes more prominent and the data utilized by algorithms and AI and so forth is going to become even more and more of a relevant issue for the federal government. And they're moving towards the idea of an as a service, a shared service model, similar to what you have with the Quizmos and so forth. We have a consolidated office that would be at GSA to GSA, OMB, whatever it may be, where they decide, but a consolidated office to manage data similar to what Nicole was talking about. So that conversation is being had on Capitol Hill right now to leverage the shared service functions and shared service model in order to do that.
That's very interesting. Actually, to piggyback both of those comments, one of the other concepts we were kicking around. It's a new concept to me, but there are apparently maturity models related strictly to kind of data and analysis, right? So we've explored as a larger subcommittee the concept of a maturity model for, I think, the broader category of incorporating sustainability into federal acquisition and kind of looking at things where they are on the maturity model and moving them upwards. This to me is where this topic is where a more narrow maturity model seems to make sense, right? And to break it down, I think the way Nicole described it, I see when it comes to vendor select or vendor entity analysis, vendor scorecards, I think we're very low on a maturity model, right? We don't necessarily even know what data might go into it. We have some idea, we have some tools, but I can't point to, except for maybe one entity we're aware of, any particular entity that has kind of that vendor entity data analysis, matrix or regime where they are making procurement decisions based on data. However, when it comes to product selection, I would say we are, the federal government at least, much further along on the maturity model, right? There's data, there's eco labels, there's ISO labels, there's product analysis, there's disclosures, there's available databases, there's the SF tool, there's the green compilation. I mean, there's a huge array of data already available on the product side of things, right? So I would say, to me, that kind of illustrates almost the dichotomy of where a maturity model might lay. Depending on what topic you're looking at, federal government may have data and they may have a mechanism for analyzing that data, and they may be able to make decisions on it, such as for certain product categories where there's a long history of available data. And I would say almost now for low carbon concrete has moved kind of into that universe where there's a lot of objectively available data and we can make procurement decisions based on kind of concrete mixes. But for a lot of other stuff, we have no idea even what questions to ask yet. And so we're kind of like at step one. But it's just another, I would say there's probably a framework out there, but data analysis and maturity isn't really my specialty. I'm not sure if anyone else has any other perspectives on that. Leslie, we haven't heard from you in a while. You're absolutely one of our resident experts on this topic. I can't hear you, Leslie. Still can't hear you. Sorry. She'll be back. Okay. Jenny, how about you?
Hello. I'm
Greetings.
a little sick today, but I will chime in. I had a little hand clapping during Nicole's when Nicole was talking earlier. I think that it's a really important point as far as the vendor and the product level is really important to capture. So I think that was one of the most important things there, is that it's good to make sure that we're looking at vendors, but then, especially a lot of larger vendors, making sure we're going beyond that, and looking to where can we, what are the opportunities as far as data. But I do agree that the low on the maturity model, as you said, or there's still a lot of room. And so figuring out where it makes sense to go next, and to kind of build upon that, I think is really important here. So thanks for laying that all out, Luke. That's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny.
Apologies for that technical snafu. Luke, I just joined the call a couple minutes ago, so I'm not even sure what you're talking about. So give me a few minutes to get up to speed.
Sure,
And
no problem,
apologies
Leslie.
for being
Yep.
late.
Yep. So I'll even tee it up for you, because what we're really trying to dig into is where we can narrow in on a data related recommendation that would be helpful to the GSA. And so, some of the things we've been talking about are data related to products, data related to vendor evaluations, but making the data available, figuring out what's available, making it actionable, who's going to own it, and how are we going to kind of use it in procurement decision making at both the buyer acquisition level, but the strategic level, the executive level, and tracking it. It's just such a broad category, and I feel like we talked about it so much, and we've had some good presentations on it, but getting us to kind of narrow in on how we can recommend something to the GSA in one of these categories or peripherally related, that would be meaningful, I think. We'd love to hear your 2 cents, either now or later.
Yeah, well, why don't I listen a little bit to where the conversation is going so I don't repeat something
Sure.
somebody else has said, and I'll jump in.
Sure. Troy, how about you?
Yeah, thank you so much. And just thank you for the framing of this conversation. I think the slide deck just really set it up really well. And so I think just my overall comment is I agree, there's so much potentially here. We only have a couple of months towards our next public meeting. And I think certainly, some areas I think to me are particularly important to talk about, even if we don't come up with the full answers, to urge GSA to move forward, how do you get to the most meaningful impact, and how do you really track the sustainable spend, and how do you kind of set up a whole framework within GSA for answering all these questions about data. But I think that at the end of the day, even though the subcommittee is only going to be able to dive into some specifics in detail, I think that GSA would really benefit from the subcommittee and the full committee laying out just the full array of questions we're coming up related to data that someone needs to be digging into, so that even if we don't have all the answers, and we're not going to, that kind of lays a roadmap for where we're identifying gaps. And I think that if we lay that out, that would be very beneficial for GSA. And also, Nigel, as you point out, the Hill is interested in this as well, and that would help give them some guidance as to where their legislative efforts might be best beneficial. So thanks, everybody. This is a terrific discussion, and look forward to the rest of it with GSA.
Thank you, Troy. So I haven't read it in a while, but I know there was that executive order. I think, Boris, you had brought it up about contracting data maybe 6 months ago, 5 months ago. Is anybody aware of that? And was there any material in there that would be informative? Does nobody know what I'm talking about? Tracking contracting data and utilizing it, I think, in procurement decisions. Is that right, Boris?
Well, there was an initiative. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yes.
There was an initiative called the Better Contracting Initiative. So not an executive order, but an initiative that's been launched out of OMB, and it is ongoing. So there's 4 different lanes, and one of them is related to data. So it's on the radar. So everything you're talking about here is on the radar for more than sustainability, actually, beyond the whole topic of data as it relates to contracting. So that's part of that. The thing that I did want to update you all on is the proposed rule on sustainable procurement that the committee commented on last September. So that rule is in its final stages. So it's not final yet, hasn't been published yet, but I can tell you that it is definitely in its final leg of the journey. And so that should be coming out sometime in the spring. But there's been definitely a push to get that rule to the finish line. This is the one that rearranged everything in Part 23, and that you all had a chance to provide comments on.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, but it's definitely on the radar. This whole topic of data is definitely something that has been looked at government-wide.
So how, go ahead,
And again,
Nigel, please.
and just for informational purposes, connecting again to Capitol Hill, there are actually a number of bills right now on collecting, reporting disaggregated data for federal procurement purposes. The SBA has annual reporting on the utilization of small businesses, and then they break that down for their programmatic pieces. So, excuse me, small disadvantaged, women-owned, small hub zone, service-disabled veteran, and so forth. There are a number of bills, one by Congressman Joaquin Castro out of Texas, another one, what's her name, out of Robin Kelly out of Illinois, to disaggregate the data for socioeconomic purposes and race and gender purposes, so they get that more detailed. Turns out that the government does collect it. They report it to SBA, but was not purposefully disaggregated and reported out publicly. So that is an effort that they're doing. One of the bills actually not only goes, Robin Kelly's not only addresses, like Boris said, it's not just the procurement that goes through your regular process, but also grants, federal spending. So there's a lot of effort around that to follow the federal dollars and report out in that way. And that's what's also driving the initiative around having a centralized data management function as a shared service, because the more data, the more challenging to manage, but also given the technology improvements that we're getting with AI and robotic process automation and things like that, we are able to get a deeper dive into the data. So then that takes me to a question. I understand this is Rich, your idea around the incorporate your data with past performance, your voluntary scorecard and signature. How can we get some teeth around that to put it in so it's voluntary? I mean, unless you mandate some things, folks don't really want to follow it. And if there's no way of holding them accountable, how do we make sure that they are moving towards these green choices versus just keeping it optional?
Well, if you look at the evaluation formulas that are being used for these large GWACs, like Alliant and others, what you could do is put enhanced credit in the evaluation formulas for this type of data reporting and adherence, to these green principles. So Nigel, I guess where I'm coming from is I just really do favor, as a broad proposition, carrots over sticks, and I think you could let market forces dictate compliance because it's in their strong economic interest to do so. But adding additional regulatory overhead on small businesses just increases their costs and make the federal government less attractive for small and innovative and non-traditional companies to participate.
So do you think would it be feasible not only at the large GWAC level, but trickling that down even to task orders and things, like giving credits for you're saying competitive credits for these things as part of their bid proposal evaluation? How far down could that work?
Well, I mean, it's administratively more streamlined to put it at the IDIQ level. As if you get your hunting license by joining an IDIQ opportunity, the task order level is really the CLIN structure and the pricing is intended for that at that level. But if you bake it in, go to NASA SOUP Next Gen is going forward right now. I mean, these big IDIQ, and particularly the small business segments within it, are I think a useful place where you could embed into the way they're assessed. I would put it up at the IDIQ level because that's the criteria to even obtain a hunting license.
Hey, Richard, could you define that acronym and just talk a little bit about it for the benefit of everybody?
Which acronym? I used
the IDIQ.
IDIQ.
Oh, indefinite delivery. Go ahead. Somebody was going to jump in there. indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. It's just it's a generic term for these large umbrella government-wide acquisition contracts, which we call GWACs. They're also MACs too.
There-
No, you got it. Yeah.
There's a lot of alphabet soup.
A lot of
But-
alphabet.
So Rich, I like the idea, and I'm just trying to figure out how to get it to reach all levels of, similar to the cybersecurity regulation that came out about, even if you're a prime, you need to be able to do a cyber inventory of your first, second, third tier subcontractors. The idea is, as we're moving towards zero trust, every access point is a risk. Every access point is, in this situation, an opportunity. So is there a way to do it like that, so we are reaching the second and third tier folks who are on the ground?
You pass guidance. I don't think it even needs to be in the FAR or regulatory, but just pass guidance that this is going to be an integral part of prime contracting subcontracting plans. I mean, every prime contractor has to have a subcontracting plan. So that's a requirement. So you bake it into the criteria that goes into the subcontracting plan.
Got it. Okay, I like it.
That's, by the way, that's the fastest way to have direct impact, is to go to the large, the large providers. I mean, let's go to Lockheed Martin and the big contractors, SAIC, the big SIs, systems integrators, and just require that they amend their subcontracting plans to include this requirement for their supply chain. That's where the smalls are, by the way, many of them.
Hey, Rich, to add a comment to what you said about past performance, just for the benefit of all. So this is a very important data system for the government. Here's where vendors, we track the information about vendors' performance on their contracts. So this is very near and dear to the hearts of vendors, because this is going to dictate oftentimes future opportunities. So what you're talking about, I think this is a really good connection you're making. That's something vendors pay close attention to.
It is an existing database called PIPRS, PIPRS, and I don't know what the acronym stands for. Past information something.
Past Performance Information Retrieval System.
Thank you.
Is that different from SAM's, or is that part of the same?
SAM is the umbrella. SAM is the portal. And I mean, there are 8 or 9 of these key databases that contracting officers have to go and check. They have to check to make sure you're not suspended and debarred. They have to check your, there's a whole bunch of them. Seven last count. And Sam tried to bring them all together and for ease of access.
Past performance is incredibly important. Important. Yeah.
Right.
But it's probably tracked on more of like achieving contract. I don't know, or is it? Do you think there's an opportunity in that tracking for something sustainability related? I mean,
so what the past performance database looks at is the quality, the way they're graded. They do a government job, they complete the job, and the contracting officer is responsible for filing a report in the PIPRS system as to how good or bad they did. And it's used as a kind of a reference database. And what you could do is ask or require in terms of past performance, is one thing would be the extent to which or how well they were green. And then as long as it's neutral and the questions are the same for everybody, so that you can compare apples to apples. When a new opportunity comes up, the first thing they're going to check of a potential bidder is how good their past performance was.
interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. And it would have to be something not subjective, right? There would probably have to be some green requirement they either met or failed to meet, and some sort of process by which they would got a score.
Right. And so in acquisition parlance, the government contracting officers have got to look at the bidders and see whether they are responsive and responsible. Those are terms of art. Responsive means that the bid is responsive to the specific requirements, and the performance is going to meet the needs of that requirement. Responsible means that they are financially secure, they're ethical, they have good past performance ratings, they've done a good job. They're the kind of company that government should or would want to do business with. So those two buckets, the categories, are two entry-level reviews or assessments that each contracting officer is required to perform before moving forward with a procurement opportunity.
Thank you, Richard. You're speaking my language now. So does anybody else have any other additional thoughts on this category, perspectives on where we should go, where we've been?
I just had another question about
Please.
the past performance tracking. Is there any metrics about like cost that's tracked as part of that? I think that in terms of justifying sustainable procurement for the long term, like understanding the correlation between achieving a sustainability outcome and the cost associated would be helpful. So curious about that.
Certainly when the contracting officer post-performance goes in and writes up the past performance, good, bad, or indifferent, by the contractor, if the contractor has been fiscally irresponsible and has jacked up contract overruns and has cost the government more money than they should have, and been inefficient in terms of their financial reporting or financial responsibility, they'll get the past performance will write that up, that has occurred.
Thanks, that's helpful. Be interesting to like think about a streamlined way to capture that consistently across projects.
Well, I mean, the core elements there are cost, schedule, and performance. What did the contractor do? And did they meet the requirements for cost, schedule, and performance?
Thank you, Richard. Any other thoughts on this? I think we have 60 days. We have your input. We have an enormous wealth of information up until now. And I think what we also have is potential connective tissue to some of the other subcommittees. So what we'd like to do, I think, is put together a task group to try to, probably by the next meeting, come up with a hypothesis on what this recommendation would look like. And I think we would look to see if there's anyone in the other tasks, in the other subcommittees who might be interested in participating on this task group. And at least come up with a hypothesis by the next meeting so that we can finalize it in the run up to May. But because time is short, this means our cadence is gonna accelerate. So I would anticipate we'll start meeting fairly regularly between now and April.
Hey, Luke, if I can talk to a schedule just
Sure.
right now, is the next public meeting of this subcommittee is April 18th. So 4 weeks from today. Before then, we can certainly, before that task group, we can have meetings as many of them as we need to work. We can do an admin meeting, so you have some flexibility via the admin meeting route.
Yes.
But just to put a mark on the wall, so the 18th of April is the next public meeting for this, and that will be the last one before the full committee meeting on May 22nd.
Yep. So I guess what I'm looking for first is volunteers. We've had such a good stable of folks who have volunteered to take the pen on all of our other recommendations. Who'd like to be part of the group that's going to lead this one? Thanks for volunteering, Amlan. Appreciate that.
That was nice.
I didn't even have to wait for you to raise your hand. I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming.
I'm happy to do a write-up on what past performance, how it works, and where it is in the FAR.
All right.
Yeah,
Richard.
and Luke, if I may add a quick comment, since you've already told me, I think I'm comfortable writing the product sustainability component of it, but some of the vendors, the vendor qualification components, I think there is a lot for me to learn there. So I'd be happy
Yep.
to.
Product. Okay, good. Nicole.
Yep, count me in, but also know that I'm keeping one eye towards the acquisition workforce, because if there are important intersections there that we need to convey, I would like to be part of that so I can help make that happen.
Perfect. Perfect. Okay, great. Okay, good. So we'll start up. Oh, and Mark, I think I saw you raise your hand.
You caught me. So yeah, I'm happy to do some overview. I don't know if I can participate as much as others, but I will definitely look it over and put in my 2 cents.
Good, great. Well, the best part of this is the more of us participate, the less we each have to do. So thank you for volunteering.
And Luke, I think I agree. Like, these data issues are crossing over all the subcommittees, so I think it'll be worthwhile for Cassius and me to have a conversation with Boris and Stephanie to talk about, like, how do we kind of tie some of this together, and yeah, like, kind of what, because it seems like this is like primarily going to be within this subcommittee if it's your focus, but it does touch on things from other subcommittees, so it's a little different maybe than the other recommendations that we've rolled up that each come from one subcommittee. So let me talk to Boris and Stephanie about that and see how we can help from full committee level, either, with the task force, and then also tying into the other subcommittees.
Terrific. Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah. I mean, as we've only scratched the surface here. There's probably 100 different ways we could slice this up into, and so if we have 3 different task groups interested, we can figure out where the overlap is or isn't. And so I think we're right on cue here for 4 o'clock. Are our esteemed GSA guests present?
I just wanted to throw my hat in for the kind of the same level that Mark was talking about, a review of just being able to comment, but not necessarily draft.
Great. Okay.
Sorry for jumping in late there.
Even better. Thanks, General.
Yeah, look, I did ping Stephen and Melissa, so I know they're coming from other meetings. But Michael is here and he's heard the conversation. And Michael is a wealth of knowledge. So,
right.
Michael is like,
esteemed and wealthy. How about that?
Oh yeah,
oversold.
Buttering you up. Okay.
Right. I also wanted to let you all know that because many of the questions pertain to SF Tool product search, I invited Paul Shariari, our contractor that knows the data behind SF Tool product search, to join us as well. And I was listening to a lot of the conversation up front, and think that in tandem we can answer more of your questions with both of us here. I do know that Stephen just joined and Melissa's coming. My apologies also, we got a set of questions from the group, but not with a lot of time, at least for me, to prepare detailed answers. But we will do our best to respond to your questions and think on our feet.
Great.
Thank you.
I think we have everybody here. And Michael, just for clarification, the questions were just meant to be conversation starters. So just, FYI, but you've heard the whole conversation right now. I think this is where the group is going to go. And I think you all are in a great position to help kind of crystallize. Yeah.
Thanks, Boris. And I think that one of the main things, maybe you were planning to do this, but for Melissa and Stephen, who just joined, for an overall summary, perhaps going back, Luke, to how you framed the big issues, not all of it, but essentially the fact that this group is struggling not just to understand data about products, but also about vendors. And there's a big distinction in the way that those of us who work on sustainability deal with those two groups. And so because I know this this committee cares a lot about vendor access to the federal market. That's what drives a lot of the folks who are here to participate to the level you do. I know that at least I might provide short shrift to that because I don't deal with vendor data or vendor information directly in most of what I do. So I was wondering if before we dive into things, you might summarize the kind of high level goals of this committee right now so that we can speak to your questions with an idea that you care about both vendor and product data.
I'm sorry, Michael. Yeah, I lost internet for like half of your ask, but I think you wanted me to recapture where I started and kind of a little bit of our journey to tee it up for the rest of the GSA folks. Is that right?
I think so, especially when it came to product and vendor, caring
Yep.
about information about products and vendors.
Yeah. So I think, we have been enormously impressed with a lot of the tools that the GSA has available. SF tool, green products compilation. I mean, your tools, I'll say as a state procurement practitioner, they're amazing. And we use them all the time, and I can't integrate them enough into what our daily practices are. And so what we're trying to navigate as a committee here is how we can focus on some sort of recommendation that will help lead the GSA to, the next level of something. And so we've tackled multiple topics since we've began our work almost 2 years ago. But what we've zeroed in on in this kind of final quarter of our work is the topic of data. And it has been a kind of a recurring and underlying theme in everything that we've done up until now, right? So when it comes to vendor selection, what data do we have to assess, evaluate, and understand a vendor? In particular, when it comes to a green vendor, what are their past performance, successes? What are their practices? What is it that they have in place? What are their greenhouse gas emissions as a corporate entity? Is there a scorecard by which we can measure and evaluate them and give them points and therefore give them a competitive advantage when it comes to vendor selection? Separate and apart from that is, as you noted, product, right? So when it comes to products, there's an enormous amount of data depending on what category, the product falls into. And so is there a next level of that? Is there a recommendation or something that we can spark that might help elevate that, integrate it, or maybe create some sort of governance around it? Because, to some extent, maybe there's almost too many choices when it comes to product selection, or can we simplify it for the acquisition professional so that decision-making becomes easier? But holistically, it is this concept, this vein of data that runs through almost everything. And so in certain topics and in certain areas, the data is good and great and can be good for decision making, and decisions are being made. But in many areas, there is no, fundamental third-party verified valid data upon which we're comfortable making procurement decisions, right? And so it's such an overwhelming topic for us. And we've been kicking it around for a long time in all of these different contexts, and from all of this subcommittee's different points of view, that we really wanted this conversation to help us narrow down, what is it that you guys in your work, in your day-to-day work, see as a gap that could be filled, or things that we could help make a recommendation or spur some innovation, or even have some, create some, instill some creativity and come up with some solutions to help you guys out.
Hey, look,
how was that for the 2-minute version? Was that okay?
That was
Okay.
awesome. Yeah, you're
All
hired.
right,
I was going to suggest that maybe our guests can introduce themselves and talk
Absolutely,
about
yep.
what they're working on. And I thought might be a good place to start, if I may. Maybe we start with Michael and Paul, and then we'll go to Melissa and Stephen.
Sure. So Michael Bloom, I'm in the Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings. I do a lot of crossover work with sustainable procurement because so many products go into buildings, but also because we're the owner of sftool.gov. And I've been managing SF Tool since it started in 2011. You know me from that. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Paul Shariari, I'm the founder and chief innovation officer at Ecomedes. We're a software company dedicated to making it easier for buyers to buy products that they've aligned with whatever goals and strata they have. And I met Michael probably about 10 years ago, and he gave me the GPC and said, here are our rules. Can you build out algorithms like you have for LEAD and WELL and all the other rating systems that go out and look for the data that have met the compliance that the federal government's looking for? And we've amassed the largest database of those products. So on a monthly basis, we go out to everything that we can go digitally reference directly at the source of data, bring that all in, merge it upon brand names, product names as best we can, and then present it to federal buyers to where it's easier for them to see a single product that might have 4 or 5 eco labels achieved, all the other data that they might need, and then allow people that are doing the buying or the selling to actually all be working off the same data set instead of it being a full scavenger hunt every single time, because the data is updated, in most cases daily, if not weekly, certainly monthly. And it's that long tail of always going out and getting refresh data that has been the struggle, I think, of this entire industry. It's just an endless amount of work, and nobody wants to do the work, and then nobody really wants to pay for the work to be done for them, because it's a lot of work and it never ends. I think the reason I have so much gray hair is that I've been doing this for 25 years, started with a spreadsheet that had 12 attributes to do all the green building decision making you needed to lead. And now our database has 3,000 attributes, half of which I could attribute to our work with Michael Bloom and the federal government, which is fun to do. But I think it's interesting that the government of Canada just recently contracted us to do something similar for them, but they're starting at almost ground zero, and they want to actually learn from what GSA has done over so many years, so they don't go down some of the same rabbit holes that they have to struggle with every day. So I'm here to listen, learn, share with whatever I can share with you guys, because I definitely don't want anyone to do repetitive work.
Melissa?
I'm Melissa Miner. I'm the Climate Sustainability Lead in the Office of Industrial Climate within the FAC Office of Policy and Compliance. So I support the Green Procurement Compilation. I also help implement recent executive orders for FAS, kind of educating the workforce and our suppliers on how executive orders and new GSAR or FAR cases as they come through, or implementation of FAS acquisition policies whenever they relate to sustainable acquisition initiatives.
Stephen.
I'm Stephen Baker. I am the e-commerce modernization lead for the catalog management office, which means that I touch all the systems that handle the data, and I work on integrating all of our data sources and then figuring out the right way to display it to our vendors, or how to connect our other systems, like trying to connect SF Tool, which is like a PBS product, with GSA Advantage, which is for our mass products. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Lots of data.
And I would say that each of us has our own different pain points in terms of what we think probably needs to be fixed first, and are aware that some of the fixes are ones of bandwidth, funding, and stakeholder engagement, even within GSA, to be able to pull off recommendations that you've made before, or things that we hope to do together. So I don't know where best to start, but ask away.
So thank you for those introductions. I know we're some familiar faces here we've met before. David has volunteered to graciously lead the discussion on behalf of the group, so I'll pass the mic to David. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Luke, and great job on the first half of our meeting today. And nice to see you again, Michael, Melissa, and Stephen. This is actually to any of you. I'm interested in knowing sort of what your desires and fixes and gaps are, because I think that's at least certainly what I'm struggling with is, where can we be most useful to you? Are there things that we can recommend as a subcommittee or as the GAPFAC that can move along some things that may otherwise be unmovable? That's wide open, and I think that will greatly inform, I think, the directions we may wish to go.
I could go with one. Michael and I have the desire to connect SF Tool and GSA Advantage, and he's come up with some nice slides that show what that would look like and how we could go between page to page. We've done some initial work with Paul and trying to figure out how our data sets would work. I think it's possible. I think it requires a little more investment, a little more systems work. bringing in another data source to help align products with the way we deal with mapping products and the way ecomedes and in general green products, how they're identified. I think we could do it. I think we need some pressure from above, right? That needs to be a recommendation to link those tools because they should be linked, right? If we're telling people in the government what they should buy, we should also tell them where to buy it because we've also vetted those vendors. So that would be one of the recommendations I would make. And then the second one that fits that as well is the difficulty of matching green identified products with the actual product itself, right? So we asked for that. We made that recommendation, I think, back in June, that there needs to be a standard. There needs to be some kind of either committee or, and you guys already made that recommendation, right? That the GSA should lead some sort of a standard. I don't think it's necessarily the GSA's role, and I think that's kind of the pushback you're going to get from that recommendation. But there needs to be a standard. So those would be my two things, and they're very interconnected, right? Because being able to match the tools together depends on the data, and the data is not great.
I'm glad you went first, Stephen. I echo what you said. I would also say, talking about data, that data sharing agreements are necessary between the government and the organizations and accrediting bodies that hold the data. And that is something that needs attention beyond just one person who I'm working on that now, but that's a huge job. And when we want a free-flowing regular stream of data that both the owners and the government can interact with, we need to open the flow of that and also have data governance present, or some organizations are loath to share their data, right? And we as the government could own all of that, all of the eco-label data that we want and make it useful in the ways that this committee has envisioned. But there's those data sharing agreements that need to be brokered first. And there aren't a lot of examples currently out there for sharing responsibly sharing and managing data that's already public. Seems like it's funny that you'd need a data sharing agreement for that, but it is necessary because we're actually committed not to change the data that they give us after they give it to us. But if they give it to us, I'll give a silly example. Paul can give us many more. If we say kitchen cleaner should be the same as multi-purpose cleaner, but they gave it to us as kitchen cleaner, and somebody's looking for multi-purpose cleaners and it just never shows up, we didn't want to change that on their behalf without their permission. It's a teeny problem, but it's not teeny, because if we're going to automate all of this, we actually need the ability to have the data come in a flow that can be aggregated automatically by matching, and have the owners of that data trust that we're doing the right thing with it. So we can solve a lot of these data problems if we maintain that trust, and if we figure out how to both have data shared broadly and malleable enough to be able to fall into the right category. Related to that, like Stephen did, I think we need to simplify the number of categories we use to actually put rules on. That's not a GSA thing. We can't do that by ourselves, but I believe that in many cases, a straw man of saying we need to simplify, everybody says yes. How do we simplify? People don't know where to start. And so pulling people together who can say, okay, for this category, let's radically simplify this so that we can automate and understand this set of products better, will go a very, very long way. I'll stop there. Melissa, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of what we do is provide the suite of tools with GSA Advantage, where you go to buy a conceptual product search, where you can find products that are in compliant with what's on the green procurement compilation. And the suite of tools is great, and it's been working for a long time, but to kind of advance it to that next stage, having them talk, having the systems talk, having a buyer, when they're looking at the SF tool product search, be able to link straight to the catalog of awarded prices with vendors that are offering that product, and it would make it much more simplified. I think that's a good objective.
Paul, did you want to add anything?
I think the biggest thing I have to share is that I think simplification will allow this solution set that everyone wants to scale, and the complexity is constraining it across every part of public sector, private sector. It's not as if the private sector has some better solutions. I mean, the biggest tech companies in the world still have a hard time figuring out what carpets to buy, what furniture they want to buy, even though they've got their own grids of data. I think the one consideration I'd have is that most certifications that are being referenced by all buyers are at kind of a product classification collection schema. They're not even down at a product level or even down to a SKU level. So I think there's a big mismatch between the categorization that is in the GPC, that is in the EPA's guidance that they just redid and updated. And then the eco labels, they continuously evolve their product categorization. And ultimately the manufacturers are the ones that are providing categorization. So when you look at that data mashup, you can unleash all the AI and ML you want. It's not going to do it correctly. And it'll always take, and what we do for SF Tools, we try to move a lot of the categorizations over. Flooring, non-covering carpets is one of those ones that everybody that we have as trade association partners are upset. But I'm like, if you want to be viewed by the federal government, you have to have me allow me to recategorize your product that is really a laminate or a VCT or luxury vinyl tile into that categorization, or you'll never show up in front of a federal buyer. So it drives them insane. But you know, they do that. But as soon as I transform their product categorization, I want to share it with somebody else, I have to retransform it back, and I have to do that every month. And it's a little bit of a thing. So anytime you guys can say all of the 52 categories of sub cleaner in building cleaning products, if we could just say cleaning, janitorial, and custodial is all the same thing, it'll make my life for you guys a lot easier. So just simplify as much as you can, and the data will get better along the way.
I'm going to reiterate to Paul just spoke about the EPA's new rules. I don't know if it's the same one, but the EPA did just release a new guidance on their recommended eco labels. And they said, hey, you got to have a qualified products list, right? You got to maintain, you got to have at least 2 sources of supply, 3 different products. That's huge. That is a huge step in the right direction. Like if you're going to have a label, you got to have a list, right? Just like if GSA is going to be creating a single-use plastics free label, we're going to have to make a list, right? Because we need to follow those rules. So that's huge. Like that needs to be a continued thing, right? There should be minimum data standards, which we shared back in June, I think. That's a big one.
And I will point out here that we are managing currently, SF Tool Product Search manages multiple eco labels, so you can search for them in combination. But this puzzle is really challenging. And every time you do that, you really need these categories to match. This is one of the reasons why I'm very nervous about combining a product level data search with a vendor level data initiative in the same tool. So I think both are important, but I think they need to be kept separate. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of false negatives, meaning things that should show up but don't because things were called different. That's actually a bigger problem for us right now than false positives. We don't allow false positives. That's easy. That's easier. But really, we don't want to combine data sets that flag a bunch of things because something made by an 8A vendor was miscategorized holistically. So that's a challenge here too.
I did reach out on the question of what you were referring to as vendors versus products. And in my world, I would think that as services versus products, right? Most of my e-commerce work is on mass products, actual items, tangible items that are for sale on GSA Advantage or through other requisition channels. Services are, hey, I need a typist, I need an interpreter, I need a captionist, I need a plumber, I need a security guard. Those companies go through a different process. I did just verify there's no current collection of a GHG, like greenhouse gas emissions portfolio from those vendors. So that would be something that If you if you were really interested in on that side of the house, it would be a contract level thing. It wouldn't be a product level thing, right? Because you'd be asking, because it was like there's like 3 scopes, I think, for GHG. So you would be asking them at that vendor level. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I just got that answer back from my team.
Very much. Amlan, I see your hand up. Would you like to comment?
Thank you. Wonderful input there. I just want to, there are 2 things I want to comment on and ask your feedback. Stephen, going back to the comment of, and this has been an issue in the world of construction, is that do we know that the product we're getting is the product we're getting the label for, right? So this has been a matter of concern. And then also going back to, so we're in the process of developing various QA/QC approaches for the way the labels are associated and how the DOTs can work with properties of the material to check the constituents. So I think it may be used, an ASTM is looking into guidance along those lines. ASTM being our testing materials organization, standards testing materials. And so would you prefer something like that not to come from GSA, but let specific disciplines define their ways again? And I know nothing about surface cleaners, and I'm sure there's like a whole world of surface cleaners, but make it more product category specific and let the product categories define it. So it's not even product specific, but really product category specific. So if we kind of push towards more a product category based definition rather than a product specific. And when I say product category, for example, we can talk about all cleaners and how cleaners, what rules should apply to cleaners rather than a specific product within that family or within that category. And again, along the same lines, a very good point from Michael there about we don't want to combine vendors and products in the same. It's just going to be messy, right? Because they're kind of like orthogonal axes. Same point. If instead of doing it by product, if you talk about the sustainability of product categories. So I'm trying to create this distinction between product categories and products, because if you have rules around product categories, then we can, then the products within them can still compete within those rules and still meet a minimum requirement or a maximum requirement, as the case may be, on various criteria. And this is kind of like what we've been trying to get across through our principles document. And I was wondering if that resonates with you.
Let me reiterate. I think I kind of hear what you're saying, and I don't think they quite line up. Sort of apples and oranges. The product categories from Michael's point of view is going to be like, hey, I need a floor cleaner, right? Or I need a multi-purpose cleaner, and I want to be able to see tile cleaner. I want to be able to see a glass cleaner. I want to be able to see all these different cleaners that currently right now, because the categorization is so delineated, you wouldn't find them, right? Because you'd have to actually search each individual category. So that's where like a nice broad category would come into play. But at the product level, we still have to know the individual products, because anybody could come in and say, oh, I have a kitchen cleaner, it must be rated, right? You still have to identify the actual product. I feel like I'm missing what your question is there.
If you have the requirements for what you need from a sustainable kitchen cleaner, right, then basically whoever comes with that product can meet those requirements. If there is a way to meet those requirements, then you're not as tied to a specific brand of kitchen cleaner as much as you are looking at the category of kitchen cleaners and looking to see if a particular brand that's coming meets those criteria or not. And then there can be, Ecomedius is one example, but there could be like various organizations that rate that, and however those requirements are.
You could assign, basically you're saying, hey, a kitchen cleaner needs to meet safer choice, it needs to meet design for the environment, or it needs to meet low VOC or whatever. That is definitely one piece of the puzzle, and you could totally do. But you still have to say, hey, this individual product meets those requirements, so that when somebody does search for a kitchen cleaner, we can say, hey, we're only going to show you the ones that meet those criteria. So they have to happen, like no matter what product level has to happen. That second umbrella definitely could happen, right? You could just say, hey, all kitchen cleaners or all multi-purpose cleaners need to meet these 3 standards. That's totally
So we're getting, we're on, let me just push this a little bit further. So that's great. So we have kitchen cleaners meet these particular standards, and we have a specific product that gets third-party certified, and that does meet that criteria. So then that third-party certification process now is happening outside of GSA. GSA simply needs to see that third-party certification.
Which we have, and that's exactly what SF Tool Product Search is doing.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't display that on an advantage. If it falls into the recommended eco labels bucket, we treat it as one icon, purely because of icon fatigue. There are 30 plus, I think, recommended eco labels now. I think they just revised that. There's a lot. I can't display that all, right? Every product you look at, there'd be a alphabet of icons. So we do limit it to the kind of the federal programs, and then we have a bucket for the recommended eco labels. And that's one of the ideas of the linkage of SF Tool, right? We could bring in that data from SF Tool, maybe just display an environmental panel, right? Or just link to the SF Tool page and say, hey, other eco labels are here. Click, boom, takes you there, gives you everything you need to know. So that's somewhere we want to go.
Nicole, thank you, Stephen and Hamlin, for the question. Nicole, can you go next, please?
Yeah, sure. Stephen, it's great to chat with you again. I wasn't part of the June meeting, but I was part of an August meeting with you in another subcommittee, and really appreciated your insights back then. You said something, I think it was you, but it could have been Michael, just a few minutes ago. You talked about this notion of needing to link Ecomedes, SF Tool, GSA Advantage, and that crosswalk isn't happening as expeditiously. This is what I heard, as you would prefer. Can you give us a sense of what that pain point looks like so that the subcommittee can imagine how we might be able to think about recommendations that would alleviate that type of pain point?
To be blunt, it's going to be priorities and resources. It's been brought up and it's on the bottom of the pile. We can do it. It's going to take a little more work. It's going to take a little more funding. It's going to take work from Paul's side. It's going to take work from our market research team side. We're going to have to bring in likely a GS1 subscription. That's actually very cheap, but the development work around integrating GS1 data. So if you don't know, GS1 data is, they're the ones who manage all UPCs. UPC data that we get from vendors is notoriously terrible. We can't rely on it. So we need to bring in an outside source of UPC data. We would then match that with our catalog data and match it with Paul's data. And everywhere we could get solid matches between our products, we could then line up and create links between our web pages. The problem is the teams that do all that work are absolutely saturated right now. We are overhauling how all of mass contracting works, how the data is stored, how it gets fed to Advantage, how we do our compliance work with, I don't know if you know what the FAS catalog platform is, or if you've come across any of those acronyms, the ACR, the FCP. Those teams are fully in it right now, and we are task saturated. And that's the bottom line, is it hasn't bubbled up to the top. So that's where.
So you mentioned, you say that it's mentioned. Who's been doing the mentioning? Help me understand the nature of the conversation.
Usually it's me.
Okay.
I think you have the people who are talking.
Yeah.
About it.
Got it. I didn't know if it was coming from somewhere else, above,
I'll tell
below,
you,
right here.
These are the people that are making it happen. One clarification: mass is the multiple award schedules for the benefit of the committee. So when we're talking about mass, it's the catalog. This is like the big one at GSA. So just for clarification for the rest of the committee. Yeah.
It's your tangible products that you can hold in your hand, right?
Yeah.
Like
Right.
stuff.
The other thing that is true is that there is a lot of focus for the buy clean low embodied carbon procurement right now, which is glass, steel, carbon, asphalt and concrete, right? And wood. And that's a different category of products than what we manage in SF Tool or in GSA Advantage. That's not how we buy those things. So it makes sense that there's that focus, because the Buy Clean initiative is commanding so much attention and is a very important thing. I think this is the next step. So your advice as a committee could really set up the federal government for tackling this once it is time. So aligning resources to be ready to do this, to get all the thinking done and alignment so that when the teams aren't saturated and when this is something that becomes that next priority, we're ready to go.
If I may quickly ask a question on that, I guess, do you see a given that I've been very involved with the buy clean world, do you see this movement towards the buy clean world the direction to go in? So like where you guys are now, and you have some amount of third-party verification, you have components of that, and like would you see all of that converging towards more a buy clean type framework with thresholds, with like acceptable limits? Do you think that is a direction that you want to go in? And it may not happen tomorrow morning, but again, with the right resources, aspirationally move towards.
I will say yes. I'm
Right.
curious about it just as a framework. We already include some LCA and EPD data in SF Tool product search where available. So as that information becomes available at the product level, then we do see ourselves incorporating that. Even recycled content, which is data that we have available for some of our products, we can disclose. The challenging thing is right now we're set up to say, does it meet the federal regulations, the statutory regulations, and EPA's recommended specifications, standards, and eco labels? And only if it meets those two things are we actually able to also disclose.
He froze.
Oh dear.
Yep.
Did he freeze for everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Uh-oh.
I was going to say, Nicole, that was the August meeting, right? Where that was me and I was the one that was always frozen. Yes.
Yeah, you
Remember
had
that.
AC problems, I recall.
Yes. I was miserable.
I'd like to jump in here. I'll take co-chair prerogative while Michael unthaws out there. Hearing about sort of the overhaul of the procurement system, if I understood you correctly, and then thinking about future directions, is the overhaul focused really on very short-term things, or is the overhaul going to like have built-in capabilities for future data needs? Michael was talking about, SF Tool has EPDs. I actually went on SF Tool and did a comparison, and I saw all of the eco labels of comparable products, and I saw EPDs. One thing I didn't quite understand is whether the information in the PDFs that are the EPDs exists somewhere in some place where you can look at it or aggregate it in some way, or if that's kind of the next step of what you're all planning on doing. I guess what I'm asking is sort of how far down the road are you looking when you're building and overhauling these systems in sustainable procurement, especially on the climate change side of it, which is largely what we're focused on in this committee.
So I'll be honest on the, oh, sorry, Paul.
All the hyperlinks go back to the source of that EPD. In the case of EC3, it's digital, so you have all that stuff digitally linked. But in almost every case, if we reference an eco label or standard in SF Tool, it's going to give you a hyperlink back and a date stamp and a timestamp of when we pulled that data in. But almost always we send you back to the raw data because that's where it belongs.
And then for the actual backend GSA Advantage or GSA systems, not Advantage, all GSA data systems, right? All the contracting information. These systems are 20, 30 years old. This is a multi-year. I mean, we've got plans for the next 5 years, and our phases that we're slowly chipping away at. We've been building this, building up to this for the last 3 years, just trying to get it off the ground, and we're finally into a phase where we're bringing in vendors and it's working and it's doing what we envisioned. So the bringing in like extra green data is not on our roadmap right now. It could be. Right? Totally could be, because this is a years-long project. We will continue working, and we built it in such a way that it is more modular, right? It's less rigid like the old systems. If we need to bring in new data sources, we need to bring in new data points for each product, we can, and we can house it, and we can parse it, and we can store it. Is it on our radar? No. Is it possible? Yes.
I appreciate that. Are there others who wish to comment who are on the subcommittee?
Yeah, Melissa, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna maybe bring up, Stephen, how in November there was a change to the Advantage platform as far as automating some of those environmental designations. Did you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So something we took, right? Like when I talked to you guys in August, I think, sorry, maybe I'm mixing up June and August. I feel like I've spoke to you guys a few times now, April and then maybe June and then August. One of the things that we had been working on at the time, and I think I talked to you about, is standardizing how we deal with green icons. We finally rolled that out in November 10th, November 11th. We actually took away our vendors' ability to certify green icons for 6 or 7 icons. And we now get those directly from either the API or from our data standardization team, which also uses the Verified Products Portal. And I believe I talked to you guys about the Verified Products Portal before. So the Verified Products Portal, manufacturers are allowed to come in, they're allowed to attest, hey, I meet all these standards, and then we'll assign that if we haven't already found it through matching a government API. We then bring that over to GSA Advantage, and we call it a GSIN. Amazon calls it an ASIN, right? It's how you group a product together with multiple vendors. So if you have 3 vendors offering the same product, you have to give it some kind of an ID that buckets them together. We assign all those green icons now at that level. And we've taken away the vendor's ability to game the system, right? Because our data set diverges in 2 directions. We knew that vendors were either being lazy and not providing us data, or they were lying to make their data look better when they weren't actually, the product wasn't actually a green product. So we restricted that, and now our data set only diverges in the direction of the false or of the negatives, right? If we don't assign an icon, it's because we couldn't make a match, and then we can go manually assign it, right? We've taken away all those false positives that we were getting from vendors. So that went live in November. We still have to do it for a few other icons. EPEAT is one of them that we have to work on. But Safer Choice, Energy Star, WaterSense, Prime VOC, or Prime, Low VOC, CPG, all those are standardized now.
I think Snap and
Yes, Snap and I'm trying to.
BioPreferred.
Yes, BioPreferred. We worked with BioPreferred, got access to their API. They've been implementing some changes to add part numbers that make their data a lot more usable than it used to be. So we are making progress, which is nice.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Nicole, you have the floor. You are on mute, unfortunately.
Yeah, sorry about that. So, yeah, Stephen, this is back to you. Since August, it seems like things have been moving pretty quickly. So there was a lot in the works at that time, and you mentioned to us that the vendor self-verification was going to go away, and that has since happened. At the time in August, we were asking questions about if you were given more resources, how could it be used? And the response was, actually, resources aren't what we need right now. The biggest issue relates to these families of products that get bundled together in a way that we can't really determine whether the ultimate product that gets purchased is green or not. And that was an important area to wrestle with. And amidst it all, and I can't recall if it was you or if it was Michael Bloom, but it came up earlier in our discussion today, was this notion that GSA really isn't organized to manage the multifaceted issues related to data that are associated with sustainability and a lot of the modern conversations that are moving forward. There are legacy platforms, there are legacy ways of managing data that really don't meet the modern needs. And in looking back at my notes, one of you had talked about this notion of needing a centralizing force within GSA, an office of data or something like that. Now I say this, but I also recognize that this space is moving quickly. Can one of you all talk about this a little bit and what the current thinking is around this, whether this is still a concern?
I think you've got 2 different viewpoints on this call, because Melissa and I work for 2 different groups. I don't know if you want to give the policies answer, Melissa, or call you out in an awkward way. Or I can go first. And I think yes. Do I think GSA is the person to do that? You know, the entity to do that? I don't know. right? Because the green space isn't our space. We are, but it's kind of weird, right? Because we are pushing acquisitions, right? Like that's our space, and making people buy green is our space. But regulating green amongst other agencies, I don't know if it is. And that's kind of where we're wishy-washy on it, right? Like that was kind of the recommendation that came out. It was like, hey, there needs to be a central body. There needs to be some kind of, what I think you called it a lighthouse in August. Maybe that's the term. I think lighthouse was used, like that we were going to be, maybe that's the right term, I don't remember. But the point that worked with the other agencies to coordinate, like, hey, here's how you're going to do your data for green stuff. I believe the policy's viewpoint is that shouldn't be us. Melissa, I'm going to pass the buck.
Oh, yeah, I think it's just difficult when we aren't establishing the framework, we aren't evaluating product registries, we aren't, we look at USDA and EPA and DOE who are managing the registries or the framework for approving eco-labels, standards and specifications under their recommendations. So for us to be at the table to define how they do that, it's just a little complicated, but and that's where we also have 3 different systems where we have GSA Advantage, we have Green Procurement Compilation, and we have the SF Tool Product Search. And I know that Michael Bloom, I don't know if he's popped back on yet, but me and him.
I'm here.
Oh, good. Okay. We both work with EPA quite frequently when we're standing up our systems, doing updates, changing our sites, and get their feedback, and they work with us, and there's a lot of collaboration. But a lot of these are organizations have been established for a long time, and now we have these systems that are trying to communicate with large networks of databases, and it's just creating some congestion. And I think, it's just complicated in the GSA scope of work where we're acquisitions. We don't really have the expertise to look at product specifications and determine whether that's compliant, whether it's not. I mean, that's we can look at federal acquisitions when it comes to compliance, but we wouldn't be looking at the specifications that make up a product.
So can I pause for just a second?
Yeah.
Because we're the GAP FAC and we're within GSA's purview. That's our purview. And so if we ask, what can GSA do? What would that be? How can we help remedy some of these pain points, recognizing that it's clearly this multiplayer world? So in our last set of recommendations, we said GSA should be the convener for the conversations to get the ball rolling, because there's no one owning the conversation right now.
Right.
So outside of that, what do you see as the sweet spot that GSA can play here?
I like it. I don't know if you're going to get the traction on it. Right, because it needs to happen and nobody's going to own it.
Well,
and acquisitions are a ballpark, so it makes sense. I just don't think you're going to get the traction from it. Sorry, Melissa.
No, I was just going to say, we do go out to these environmental programs as GSA. We do share our challenges. We share what our data systems need as far as product level data, and we petition, for lack of a better word, to get buy-in, and just we've kind of taken that stance as GSA. We can educate and request changes, but as far as major movement, a lot of it comes all the way down to the manufacturers and part numbers, and I mean there's just so much more beyond our reach, I think. But Stephen kind of already talked to that. I do see benefit, like what we started off with this conversation, as far as the systems talking to each other. I think there's definitely a path for us within GSA to get there. And SF Tool Product Search has a lot of information that's product specific that if GSA Advantage, I think could benefit from just having that link. between those two systems for buyers. I think that's like a big win that we could get to. And like Stephen said, it's there. We can kind of see a path to get there. It's just prioritization right now is challenging. So getting stakeholder buy-in and seeing how big of a benefit it would be for the federal customers and the green environmental product, increasing that green environmental product purchasing.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Just very quickly, Nicole, I agree that being in the role of convener is critical. And I know that even EPA doesn't actually manage their multiple eco labels with the same teams. So we are the only organization in the conversation right now that is trying to aggregate eco labels and required federal programs together. And so it's not always from a standpoint of acquisition. It's more of this is a need federally, but also beyond, and there isn't a clear owner. That's the problem. If GapFAC were to make a very clear argument that somebody needs to own this, and here are the 7 reasons why, that could go some distance in securing the kind of higher level support that Stephen said was currently not invested in this being a high priority. I think they're invested in these things happening, but it would reprioritize this. And I think it might even pull on the pride of GSA as saying, yeah, this is why we matter.
Nicole, is the last set of recommendations that came out did call that out as a recommendation. And I've seen that document come back down through, I think, OGP and back to us. Are you suggesting recommending it again, like doubling down on it, or just more asking like where we're at with that?
No, I'm asking what's next.
Oh, okay.
Right. So there's GSA as a convener, but what I heard was that's not enough, that things are still stuck. And so, and what I'm also hearing is this is bigger than GSA. So I'm asking questions related to, well, how do we just unstick it? What's needed here?
Yeah, that's gonna be a tricky one, right? Everybody's got their own kingdom there. You've got every agency. And then to Michael's point, there's only one agency trying to aggregate it all. Everybody else has their own little backyard that they play in, and they do their stuff, and they don't have to worry about anybody else. We're the ones that need everybody to come to some kind of standard. We need them to come to the table. So it makes sense for us to be the convener, but I mean, does GSA have that leverage, power, reach, grasp, desire? I don't know.
Let me pause here for a minute. This is a really fabulous conversation to see if there is any public comment. I don't see anybody left in the call here for that, but then also we have about just under 10 minutes to wrap up our meeting.
Boris,
yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask the question, and hopefully it's not taking away from this too much or diving too deep into the weeds, but have you all experienced, this is Stephen, Michael, Melissa, any issues with the product and service codes? Has that risen as a discussion? Because you have all these different codes for, like, say, lumber and equipment and lumber, and people assigning their products not necessarily to the correct code or their code. Has that been seen as an issue? Because those codes feed into the federal procurement data system when they win contracts and things like that over a certain threshold. Could that be an issue? And I'm just wondering if that has come up.
It's an issue, not so much in the green space. We have issues with like UNSPSC because our search is based on UNSPSC. So if we get bad vendor data that groups the product wrong, when we do a search, you might get wonky products. You might search for oatmeal and get a car battery because somebody entered the wrong UNSPSC from a vendor. We have like NAICS code on our services side, right? Like I said, we're currently revamping how we handle data. Services is one of those things that we're revamping. We're rolling out a brand new MVP, a minimum viable product here this summer. And the labor category codes are an issue, right? Because BLC has their own codes, and then GSA has an old standing list of codes, and they don't match up. They're not one-to-one. It's a nightmare. We see the same thing when it comes to NAICS and UNSPSC and then the different categorizations, but the green data isn't assigned at that level, right? It's assigned at the product level. So manufacturer name and part number are my main ones that drive being able to identify a product as Safer Choice or Energy Star. So it's an issue, but not one that pertains to this problem.
Thank you.
If I may make a comment, and this is to reflect something else, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it seems like for example, Energy Star, what I think depending on which industry you're talking to, Energy Star has very different interfaces for buildings and versus for production plants. And so I think that adds to the complexity, if I'm not mistaken. So because it's still Energy Star, but it's using a different, well, probably the same underlying criteria. And I don't know enough about Energy Star, but it functions different interfaces across these different industries. Same thing with GSA's current procurement plans. Like if you look at heavy industrial, their procurement has nothing to do with any of the tools we're discussing here. Yep. It's a whole different world. And so it's like there seems to be these different systems all functioning with sometimes even philosophically very different.
Yeah, your two big dividers are going to be services, your heavy industrial, your construction, your services, and products, right? Our mass side. And Energy Star is the same way, right? Energy Star for products is a pain. Energy Star is probably one of the ones I have the most heartache with because of the way they list part numbers. It's very difficult to parse. It's very hard to identify what products are Energy Star listed based on their data set. But then they have their, production plan side, which is more the services issue. And like we already talked, we don't currently have any kind of services-based green data points. We just don't.
So do you think it would be useful to actually make that distinction and almost, again, I'm going to say this with some trepidation, make recommendations separately for services versus products, because the product space it has its own reality, which is different from the services space, or is that someplace we shouldn't go?
I think that's fair. I mean, that's my opinion, that they are two very different things, right? And the product space is very well, I mean, it's been explored, right? We have dozens and dozens of different green icons in the product space. The services space, not so much, right? We have a lot of vague recommendations or rules that you have to figure out how to apply, but they're not identified. And so it's all going to be on the vendor to attest to, and we currently don't collect that.
So I wanted to jump in here because we're coming at the end of our time. So I wanted to make sure two things. One is I want to take the opportunity to thank my colleagues, Stephen, Melissa, Paul, Michael, for coming on such a short notice, by the way. And you've provided exactly the information this group needed to hear. So I just want to commend you for a great job and just a great conversation. So I'm going to send it back to Luke and David, but you four, I really want to thank you for jumping in. So you're really helping move the needle here. So Luke and David, back to you for closing, and then I'll adjourn after that.
Sure. No, I'll just echo what Boris said. We have had a lot of conversation and a lot of dialogue here, and so being able to interact with GSA staff who are on the front lines and get the true perspective about what would be helpful, what would not, and what's realistic under the circumstances is exactly the kind of conversation we needed to have today. So thank you. We really appreciate it. David?
Thank you, Luke. Again, thank you, Michael, Melissa, and Stephen. I'm not a procurement professional. It was very eye-opening and certainly gives, I think, me and certainly everyone else lots to think about in terms of what we might recommend. So just want to thank you for being here on short notice. And I don't have anything else. Anyone on the floor have any last sort of good and welfare words for our meeting?
No, but thank you. That was a significant amount of really, really functional information for us. It's a lot to absorb, but thank you very much for participating. That was very helpful.
Thanks.
Well, if no other things, we're gonna go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Again, I'll thank everybody, thank all of our members, but also our guests today. You've done an awesome job at enlightening this group. Very well received. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
You.
Thank you. So we'll adjourn the meeting.